Saint Paul was an influential figure in the early development of Christianity. His writings and epistles form a key section of the New Testament. Saint Paul helped to codify and unify the direction of the emerging religion of Christianity. In particular, Saint Paul emphasized the role that salvation is based on faith and not religious customs. Saint Paul was both Jewish and a Roman citizen. In his early life he took part in the persecution of Christians. However, on the road to Damascus, he underwent a conversion and became a committed Christian. Himself, ethnically was Jewish, coming from a devout Jewish family. He was also born a Roman citizen in Tarsus, Cilicia, Turkey. He grew up in Jerusalem and was brought up by Gamaliel, a leading authority in the Jewish religious establishment, Sanhedrin. In addition to learning religious scriptures, he also studied Greek philosophers and was well acquainted with the Stoic philosophers who advocated a virtuous acceptance of life as a path to happiness. In his daily life, he was a tent maker. During his early life, Saint Paul was a Pharisee, a group of Jewish people who administered the law. He admitted to participating beyond measure in the persecution of Christians. This included taking part in the stoning of Stephen, a Christian, Acts 758-60, 22-21. Reason Saint Paul was so critical of the new sect which followed Jesus Christ was the fact he was appalled that Jesus died a criminal's death on the cross. He couldn't assimilate that with how a Messiah would be treated. Around 31 to 36 AD, Saint Paul relates how he became converted from a persecutor of Christians to a devout follower. However, on the road to Damascus, he reported to being blinded by a vision of Jesus Christ. He heard the voice of Jesus Christ asking Saul, "Why persecutest thou me?" Saul replied, "Who art thou, Lord?" And the Lord said, "I am Jesus, whom thou persecutest. It is hard for thee to kick against the pricks." For 3 days after the vision he remained blind and undertook a fast. He later healed of his blindness by a Christian, Ananias of Damascus. After his vision and healing, he proclaimed the divinity of Jesus Christ and dedicated his life to spreading the Christian message. Saint Paul explained that he was a servant of Jesus Christ and his unexpected conversion to ardent Christian was due to the grace of God and not reason or intellect. Saint Paul became involved in doctrinal disputes amongst the early followers of Christ. Saint Paul taught that old religious rites such as circumcision were no longer necessary. Saint Paul taught that faith in the redemptive power of Jesus Christ, who died on the cross to save sinners, was the essence of Christianity. Romans chapter 319-31. Saint Paul also negated the idea that Jews were a special people due to their lineage from Abraham. Saint Paul's teachings helped move the early sect of Judaism into the separate religion of Christianity. Before Saint Paul, followers of Jesus Christ were still associated with Judaism. Saint Paul successfully argued that Gentiles non-Jews could be converted directly to Christianity and didn't need to become Jews. First, Saint Paul threw himself into missionary work. Over the next few years, he traveled to Damascus and later Jerusalem. He made several missionary journeys around the Mediterranean basin, where he sought to spread the teachings of Jesus and offer support to the fledgling Christian community. Saint Paul visited many places, such as the island of Cyprus, Pamphylia, Pisidia and Laconia, all in Asia Minor. Later, he traveled as far west as Spain. He established churches at Pisidian, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. He later made Ephesus the central place of his missionary activity. During a visit to Athens, he gave one of his most memorable and well-documented speeches. It became known as the Areopagus Sermon, Acts 17:16-34. Saint Paul was dismayed by the number of pagan gods on display. In speaking to the crowd, he criticized their pagan worship. "As I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship, I even found an altar with this inscription, to an unknown God. So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship. and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." His missionary work was often difficult and dangerous. He often met an unwelcome response. He supported himself financially by continuing to work as a tent maker. St. Paul was instrumental in deciding that former Jewish practices such as circumcision and dietary law were not required by Christians. St. Paul taught that Jesus Christ was a divine being and salvation could be achieved by faith alone. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God, being justified freely by His grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. Romans chapter 319-31. St. Paul was a key theologian on the doctrine of atonement. Paul taught that Christians are freed from sin through Jesus' death and resurrection.